Now you would think that when you spend a very lot of money on a rifle, especially one with no safety on it, that it would come with a trigger guard, but it didn't. And even the one that they do supply, it's not even covering the trigger. It's really not good enough. Now I did make a trigger guard as soon as I got the rifle, but it was a bit flimsy and still wasn't really long enough. So I'm intending to machine one up from a solid bar. It should be strong enough, should be long enough to reach all the way back and cover the trigger. Hold it on with one fairly large screw. Should be strong enough to stop the trigger getting actuated, no matter how I treat it. Now by the time I get to the end of this, there'll be almost nothing left of that block. First thing to do is take down the top edge, give me a reference surface to start measuring on. And then what I intend to do is cut a keyway in the top. That will be a key, well not a keyway, a key itself. That will be a key that will go into the accessory rail on the bottom of the stock. So all this carry on here with feeler gauges and working the dials on the table, that's to get that cutter in the right position to start cutting a groove on each side to create a keyway in the top of the block. Now the trick there was to cut the right amount off of one side of the block and then know how thick the block is, and then cut the right amount off of the other side of the block, leaving me with a 10mm key on the top surface. I've had to wind it up to the other end so that it conventional mills from one direction. That would be too much to take in the opposite direction. Things would start chattering and chewing up. Now that did measure less than the 10mm I wanted it to be. It's about 9.95, something like that. But well, obviously wasn't going to make it any thinner, so that was good enough. Having made a key, I now need to machine most of it off. I only really need it up one end to fit in the rifle stock. Now because it's taken a full cut across the width of the cutter, it's going to start chattering and making all sorts of screaming noises. The size of mill I've got, it's something I try to avoid. Now this cut's going to be risky because having got the key at the other end to the right length, I'm going to go back into it now and then remove all of this long end of the key in the foreground. The danger is that if I wind the handle the wrong way, I'll just start machining the piece that I want, not the piece that I don't want. Now it's flipped over, I've got to take the whole thing down to something like 18mm thick. Just keep going backwards and forwards, taking off the same amount each time until getting close to the dimension. Smaller bits at the end. Now I need to get this dimension right, because once I start cutting 45-degree angles into the part, it's going to look all out of proportion and uneven if I don't get the starting dimension correct. The finishing dimensions will be all over the place. Now I've got to cut large pieces out of each end. It's got to be the right depth on that cut, and it's got to be the right length as well. This is beginning to form the shape. I'm doing this base cutting, so I'm cutting along the part and up to a stop position on the dial. I don't have a stop on the table, I just have to watch the dial every time. If I go over the 0 point on the dial, it will meet all of the material that hasn't been cut off, and at that depth it will chatter and screech quite badly. It might even come out the vise, so it's not something that I like doing. There are other ways to do this. I'm going to try a different method on the next part. So that's now got it almost to the right depth, not quite. I'll take the final bit off right at the end. But I now need to move on to making the cut the right length. At the moment it's got that obviously concave surface in it. I'm going to stroke that backwards and forwards to get that to a flat end. And then once it's flat, I can machine it to the correct length. So as I brought that cutter out on the last pass, that should have taken it to the correct length, and I brought it down a little bit as well to bring this piece to the correct thickness. Remember, I left a little bit on before I went in there with it. This is now turned up the other way, and I've got even more material to take out. And instead of face cutting, I'm going to cut on the end of the mill. The teeth on the end of the mill are much sharper than the flutes on the side. The machine's a little bit stiffer in that direction as well, so you can take a bit more aggressive cuts with it. Doing it like this, it's just not a very accurate way of cutting down. It's good for removing material. Well, it's got most of the material out. I just need to repeat what I did on the first half of it, get that bottom piece down to the right thickness, and then cut the relief to the right length. Using two angle blocks there, one for 25 degrees, the other one 20 degrees. So if I mount the part up against that, it'll give me the 45-degree angle that I want to cut next. You need to think about which angle you're going to cut though, because the part's now getting so thin and small that it's getting ever more difficult to keep hold of. And if you cut the wrong angle in the wrong place, you might find yourself faced with a part that's now impossible to put back in the vise with any degree of security. So I've got to make sure I put it in the vise higher up enough to be able to cut the material away. Now, I'm not measuring any of this, I'm just going to cut that metal down till it meets the corner of the 90-degree feature that it's got there now. So just keep taking bits and bits off and going closer and closer to the corner until I end up with a 135-degree corner instead of the 90-degree one. Can't really think of any other way of doing that, except for maybe taking some extremely precise measurements and cuts, and I'm certainly not capable of that. I don't know that the machine's capable of it. The difficulty is that on the edge of the cut it kicks up such a burr that you can't tell if the two cuts are meeting in a corner or not, because it's all filled with burr material that is just folding backwards and forwards. So I pretty much have to take a guess at whether or not that has made a genuine corner, or whether it's just an undercut or an overcut. And then I can finish off by taking off the other end on the external corner, which isn't any trouble at all, just remove it. This is what I mean about choosing to make the cuts in the right order. Now that I've made one angle cut, I can just use standard straight parallels to reference that new angle and cut all the other angles with it. I can also move the part into the middle of the vise as well, keep a good grip on it. And it's the same deal again, just really going down by eye, taking a guess on whether or not I've got that cutter into that corner. It turned out okay, they're not too bad, but that's more luck than judgment really. There's got to be a better way of doing that. And it was the same problem again, you really can't tell if that's made a genuine intersection or not. It's just all full of burr. The last feature is the hole for the screw. You need a counterbored hole. I want it to be in the middle of that rectangle so that it looks like it's been put in the right place. Doing it pretty precisely, but if you put a hole in the wrong place, or it's off centre or it's too far to one side, it's immediately obvious. It's just one of the things that people notice. If it's not in the centre, it's not in the centre. Using a centre drill, which is a drill that's extremely stiff, it won't deviate, it will go exactly where you point it at. That will make the hole to begin with. Go all the way through with the 5mm drill. A thin drill like that is liable to wander off in whatever direction it wants to, so that's the reason for using the centre drill in the first place. And that's the screw that's going to need to be put in with the counterbore. Just bring down a 10mm cutter to make a square shouldered counterboard. So that just needs some deburring and cleaning up, and it should be ready to go on. There's the guard that I've had on there for a couple of years or so. It does the job, but it's really not good enough, is it? Tiny little thin screws it's held on with as well. Never really happy with it. I could have made this guard in a rounded off and smooth style, but that really wouldn't have gone with the rest of the rifle. Everything on it seems to be straight and sharp and angular, so that's the way that ended up. and because it reaches all the way back to the pistol grip, it protects the whole trigger. Shouldn't be any risk of pulling it unless you actually want to. And if you think that was a lot of work, well, it was actually twice as much as that, because here's one that I buggered up earlier and is now scrap.